Hi, how you doing? Welcome to this video. This is a little bit of a departure for me. I thought it might be fun to look at a top 5 type video. So what we're going to talk about are the top 5 hardest fighters from the pugilistic era. I've purposefully limited this to the early era and the Broughton's rules era because it starts getting really difficult to judge them when you start looking at the London prize ring as well. So that said, let's get on with it, and we'll start with number 5. My number 5 for the hardest fighters of the pugilistic era is Jimmy Figg. James Figg. Jimmy Figg from Tame. Now, you've probably heard of James Figg. He's known as the grandfather of boxing, and he was the first ever acknowledged champion of England in boxing. Now, it would probably come as a bit of a surprise to him to be ranked as a boxer, because he didn't just fight with his fists. He fought with his fists, he fought with backsword, he fought with cudgel, and he fought with quarterstaff. And he did all of those on a regular basis. And in the whole of his recorded history as a fighter, he lost one fight. He avenged that loss very shortly afterwards. He was regularly seen in his booth at Southwark Fair, challenging anyone to come and try and beat him for a price. And he became a firm favourite on the stage, and effectively it's because of James Figg's absolute inability to accept the fact that he might ever lose to anyone that we have a sport of boxing. If it wasn't for him, it simply would not exist. This man was astonishingly hard. And this wasn't just stand-up fighting with the fists. This was an era where there were no rules. Throws and grappling were perfectly legal. Ground fighting was perfectly legal. Knees and kicks, perfectly legal. Kicking someone in the head while they're on the floor, perfectly legal. All of these things were acceptable, and he never lost. James Figg was astonishingly hard. So he's my number 5. My number 4 is Daniel Mendoza. Dan Mendoza was a small, wiry, dark-haired Jew who was, let's not put too fine a point on this, completely mad. He stood 5'7", and in an era where nobody cut weight, he was a middleweight at absolute best. Yet he dominated the sport of fighting. He never intended to be a fighter. He desperately wanted, from a very young age, to be a tradesman, to enter the world of trade and to build a solid business and make a lot of money. It was never going to happen. Everywhere Dan Mendoza went, he got into fights. He got into fights at school. He got into fights as an apprentice. He got into fights on the way to watch other fights. He got into fights with people on the way to his own fights with other people. He was always fighting, and he beat and dominated people significantly bigger and stronger than him. He was absolutely astonishing, and it wasn't just because he was fast and nimble and used that to his advantage. It was the fact that he was hard as nails. Dan Mendoza is my number 4. Number 3 is James Belcher. James Belcher was a force of nature. This man was incredible. Not only was he phenomenally good looking with incredible dress sense, he was the darling of everybody that watched, men and women, but he was something a little bit special. He sneaked out of the house when he was a child to go and visit the travelling fair that had come to Bristol where he lived. And as a child, he beat the champion boxer at the fair bloody. As an adult, he was even more incredible. One night, the night before he was supposed to be fighting to defend his championship, he was set upon by 4 men who had been paid to give him a kicking before the fight to make sure that the other guy won. Not only did he destroy all 4 of those people, but he did it without anybody laying a finger on him. So the next day, he took it all out on the champion, the challenger, Andrew Gamble, and destroyed him too, to the point where everybody assumed that Gamble had thrown the fight. But he hadn't thrown the fight, it was just that Belcher was cross. If it wasn't for a freak accident that ended Belcher's career at its very peak, then he'd almost certainly be ranking higher than number 3. But as it is, James Belcher is my number 3. My number 2 is John Jackson, the fighter known as the Gentleman. In the ring, he was anything but a gentleman. He only fought 3 times, and all 3 of those fights were absolutely astonishing. His first fight, this was the first time he'd stepped into a ring. He wasn't someone like Mendoza who'd grown up fighting. He was a quiet boy who'd grown up working alongside his father in the construction industry. He was a tradesman, and he was seen by a member of the fancy who took one look at him and thought, that guy looks like a boxer. And he set him up with a fight against Thomas Futrell, a veteran of 20-30 fights, undefeated, fantastically experienced and strong, powerful boxer. Jackson utterly destroyed him. And in that one fight, he went from a nobody that anybody had ever heard of to the next big thing in boxing. But that wasn't the fight that makes me think of him as one of the hardest men in boxing. That was what happened in the next fight. He was fighting against another up-and-coming challenger, and partway through the fight, he slipped and he broke his ankle, a fractured dislocation of his ankle. Now, this is an injury that would destroy the career of most sportsmen in the modern era. The kind of thing that you occasionally see whilst watching football, soccer, American football or rugby, and it's sickening to watch, absolutely horrific. Both of the bones in his leg were broken, his foot twisted off to the side, unable to walk, and likely to be disabled forever. But instead of just giving in, Jackson hit the ground, and in the 30 seconds that were available to him before he would be called for not coming up to scratch, he asked for 2 chairs to be brought to the boxing ring and for him and his opponent to be strapped into those chairs so they could carry on the fight without having to stand up. As you can expect, Jackson's opponent said no and was awarded the fight, and at that point Jackson retired from boxing. He did come back a little while later because he was the only person that anyone could think of that might stand a chance against Daniel Mendoza, the force of nature, who we've already talked about. And what happened? In 9 minutes, Jackson destroyed Mendoza. He pinned him in the corner, he grabbed him by his hair, and he beat him around the face, bloody, until he was no longer able to fight. This was a man who shouldn't have been able to walk, yet he destroyed the great Mendoza, the reigning champion. And that's why Jackson is my number 2. And here we come to it. Number 1, the hardest fighter to ever step into the ring in the pugilistic era. Thomas Molyneux. Tom Molyneux was a black American born into slavery. He endured unimaginable hardships during his life, and yet he fought his way to freedom by the strength of his fists alone. He earned enough money to move from the plantations in Virginia, where he was a slave, to be a free man in New York. And while he was there, a former slave battled his way to be the first ever champion of America in boxing. If that wasn't enough, he paid for his passage to England, at which point He established himself as a fighter in England and fought his way to challenge the great Tom Cribb, who probably could have made this list if it wasn't for Molyneux. Molyneux is the only person on record to knock Tom Cribb out cold. Now, clearly, he was robbed of the title. I won't go into that because it's a story all of its own. Go watch Stories of Greatness, Thomas Molyneux. This man was the champion of the world, the first ever champion of the world in boxing. The title was not given to him, it was given to Cribb. And because of that, Molyneux never claimed the title that was his by right. But there is nobody in any era of boxing that I would say was harder than Thomas Molyneux. What he endured, what he went through, and what he achieved by dint of his fists and his strength of will and his ability to dish out punishment and absorb it in equal measure, make him my number one. Thomas Molyneux, the hardest prize fighter to ever live.